Okay, people, welcome again. Same ground rules. We're going to have an initial statement from David, responses from Teresa, Todd, and Marina. We'll open up wider, and then we'll open it up to everybody. So, David, hit it.
Oh, really? Oh, that was abrupt. Why don't you introduce me and say what I'm talking about so I'll remember? Oh, ultimate goals. Okay. As a matter of ultimate goals, obviously I can speak only for myself. But I can throw out my own perspectives. I guess I could say, speaking as one of the 2 million leaders of Occupy Wall Street, I have my own vision of where I think this thing ought to go, and I guess the reason they put me on first is they wanted somebody, radical, to say something extreme. So I'll try to say something that most people won't agree with. Okay, so I think, first of all, we're talking about, we're not going to chip away at capitalism, by closing a port. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, one of the things which I think is interesting is the incredible panic that seems to beset this country's elites when they see something like a social movement arising. That's what I keep telling people, because, activists spend most of their time feeling sort of pathetic and helpless. Whereas people seem to be, running the show, seem to be designing all of their policies around ensuring that we continue to feel that way. Well, that in itself tells you something. They seem to be more. I've seen them, shut down the IMF meetings so that we can't do so. They're so obsessed with preventing or any sort of successful anti-war movement that they will create terms of engagement which will ensure they don't win the war. So they seem to think we're incredibly important. Maybe they know something we don't know. So with this in mind, it occurs to me that, what we've really seen for the last 30 years, what neoliberalism really means, it's a system where, capitalism has put all of their chips in the political side of things and not in the economic. What neoliberalism means is, given a choice between doing something that will make capitalism seem like the only possible economic system and doing something that would actually make capitalism a long-term viable economic system, they always choose the former, and as a result, the one battle they've really won is convincing everybody that they're the only possible game in town, and in doing so, they've basically destroyed capitalism. The system is falling apart, and we're in the system where nobody can imagine anything else. So the first thing I'd like to propose is that systems come to an end. This one certainly will. There's every reason to believe it's reaching its ecological and social limits. A generation from now, whatever we got won't be capitalism. That doesn't mean it's going to be better. It might be a lot worse. So it seems like the worst possible moment to have a conventional wisdom saying we shouldn't be trying to think of something better right now, which seems to be, the reaction. I've never, back in the 60s and 70s or even 80s, when it seemed like there was no prospect of capitalism really coming to an end, all intellectuals felt that they could be against it. Now that it's actually tottering, you see a remarkable number of people suddenly coming around to defending the system and giving it advice. All right, so I'd say, first of all, it seems like an imperative moment to start thinking about what something else would look like. I would also make the argument about democracy. I think that when we talk about democracy, we need to talk about the conditions that make democracy possible. And I think that we can all agree that democracy is a value. Everybody seems to. It was actually one of the things I would have said in the tactics debate. I was very impressed by APO, the movement in Oaxaca. Because they had a long debate about tactics, and it wasn't about the ethics of violence, nonviolence. It was about the larger social and political effects of what sort of tactics people adopted. And what they came to the conclusion was that either a strategy of guerrilla uprising, outright warfare, or a Gandhian pure nonviolent satyagraha type campaign would cause authoritarian politics. The only way to have horizontal democratic politics preserved was to adopt a standard of tactics somewhere in the middle. And I thought that was really interesting because, rather than saying, to what degree should we have democracy in order within this system, or is it possible, or what is a realistic expectation? Why don't we ask, well, if we all assume that democracy is a value, what are the social and economic conditions that would allow for genuine participatory democracy to be possible? Because, in a way, I was going through a lot of the work by the sort of founders of the Constitution, and they were all very explicit. I like to annoy people by pointing out that I imagine most people here know, that nowhere in the Constitution or Declaration of Independence does it say anything about America being a democracy. In fact, the people who framed the Constitution were really quite explicit in saying that, one of the major things they had in mind was creating a system which would prevent what John Adams called the horrors of democracy. But they had some fairly compelling arguments. They basically said, look, we have a society based on vast inequalities of wealth. John Adams said we have 2 million people with property and 9 million people without. What's going to happen if you have majority vote? You're going to have class warfare. They'll abolish the debts. They'll redistribute the land. He also said, there's people who are used to giving orders and people who are used to taking orders. People used to taking orders, if they're given the vote, are just going to form factions and follow charismatic leaders. Whatever you think of their particular arguments, they had a point, which is that the idea of genuine participatory voting by assemblies, what they imagined direct democracy to be like at the time, would be problematic under certain social conditions. But it seems to me that if we agree that democracy is a value, we need to think about what are the social conditions that would allow us to really have democracy. And what kind of democracy? I mean, they also assumed that democracy is a battle of interests, essentially. There are other traditions. One of the things that very impressed me about the Zapatista, there was a debate between Marcos and that he later reported, and people of indigenous communities he was trying to organize, because originally the Zapatistas was a bunch of urban would-be Maoist guerrillas who came to organize these communities and were forced to completely change their minds about what they were doing. But they had big debates about the nature of democracy. Whether you're talking about majority vote, whether you're talking about consensus, whether you're imagining democracy as a play of interests as opposed to democracy versus a mode of communal problem solving. And they gradually, and he said, these the people who are trying to organize say, no, we have this method of solving problems. That's what democracy is supposed to be like. And we propose this method for the nation and the world. That's what democracy should be. And it's hard to argue with that. The question is, what would it take to have a society where we have a lot of pressing problems we need to resolve, and it would be nice to do so in a democratic fashion. We all agree on that. Well, what would it take to get there? In this sense, I think we need to listen to the Founding Fathers when they say, like, extreme inequalities of wealth, or perhaps any significant inequalities of wealth, or, a society where some people are used to taking orders all day and other people are used to following them, won't actually support a system of democracy. But that's not an argument not to have a system of democracy, which was their conclusion. It's an argument not to have a society like that. So it strikes me that if one is going to pursue this to its logical conclusion, the only way to have a genuinely democratic society would also be to abolish capitalism in the state. We could argue endlessly about what that would mean in practice. I find it a little silly that people always want a blueprint because, that's not how social change has ever happened before, right? It's not like some guy in medieval Florence came up with an idea for capitalism and, proposed it and worked it out, and everybody said, okay, that'll be a good idea. We can't anticipate problems that will occur once we move in that direction. But I think that we can think about, we have reason to assume that the brains are there. If half the people who are now working on creating new securitized derivatives were actually working on how to set up a monetary system or economic system which would redistribute things fairly to people who actually need them, I bet they would come up with all sorts of ideas. There's endless possibilities. But I'd like to throw out one final thought about what that would be like only. I will say, yeah. So the question of would a free society be one based on would it have a place for markets or would it not? The question is like, I don't know, but I want to build the institutions where people can make those decisions for themselves so we can find out. And I think that's why focusing on democracy as the initial element is so important. I will say this. I think that this is something that one of these things you never get to say. I was at some cocktail party with some rich people, and one of them was saying, well, what do you guys really want? Are you saying you want this total equality of wealth? I mean, you just want everybody to have exactly the same? And of course, I formulated a pretty good answer to that, and then they changed the subject, and I never got to say it. So I'll tell you. I remember being really impressed by an archaeologist friend of mine about, this might seem extraneous, but it's not, Uruk Wan. It turns out that our entire conception of history has to change because of some radiocarbon dates that people had gotten wrong. It turns out that urban civilization was extremely egalitarian for the first 1,000 years. They used to think it was 20 years, but it's about 1,000. Mesopotamian civilization was rigorously, there's no signs of social differentiation. In fact, every house in the cities was exactly the same size. They were obsessed with exact equality, and something gave out, and nobody was quite sure what. They used to think it was urbanization itself. Clearly, it's not. Now they're thinking it's beer, but I'll go into that. Yeah, we could go into that later. The point is, in a way, that obsession with equality is itself brings the fruit of the problem, because it means that everything can be compared and quantified. So I think the answer to that question is, we don't want a society where everybody has exactly the same, or is worth exactly the same. We want a society where asking that question would be idiotic, would be meaningless, because people are all different. People have different projects, values, and ideas. There's no reason these things should be made commensurable. We've created this bizarre system to make it so, which is itself the problem, no matter what we do with it. And thus, what I think our long-term vision is, insofar as people who feel like me, is I want to see a society where people are sufficiently secure in their basic needs that they can make up their own minds what sort of larger structures of value they wish to pursue, which are going to be inherently incommensurable. They're going to be all over the map. They're going to be things we can't even imagine. And that's what a free society would actually be like.
Thank you.
Todd, you're going to be next, but let's keep comments about 5 minutes each in response. Yeah, I will. Todd, 5 minutes.
Alphabetical?
No,
she's one letter in front of
me. No. It says in this order. Let's have you.
Maybe you. No.
No. But with a microphone.
Okay, here we go. 5 minutes. So I'm happy to pick up where David left off. Actually, I would radically dispute the notion of ultimate goals. The notion of ultimate goals kind of gives me the creeps. I don't think we're about ultimacies. At least I'm not. Plurality is a good place to start. The principle that a society affords people the space in which to become who they wish to be. Now, that's easily said, but I think it's maybe easier to be clear about what's ruled out if we adhere to some value of that sort. What's ruled out is absolutism of various sorts. I can think of three that are in particular relevant. One is the absolutism of the state, about which not that much needs to be said. The means have changed. The right to require of people that in order to get a parade permit in Chicago, you have to specify in advance how many objects you will carry, is an absolutist principle, and it is forbidden in a decent society. Just as the ownership of persons is forbidden in a decent society. So that one is analytically quite clear. The tyranny of capital is a second form of absolutism that is indecent. Part of what happened in the run-up to our current situation was that a conspiracy, in the sense of people breathing together, of bankers and technicians with PhDs and rating agencies and investment bankers, insurance companies, and affiliated politicians contrived to create an international economic system in which if you were a citizen of Iceland, you essentially had no choice but to put your money in a bank that was heavily invested in securitized mortgage, whatever they're called, which had been declared to be commensurable in value because some agency, a rating agency, found it profitable to promote its measure, its universal measure of value of this junk. And that's how the world crashed. The tyranny of capital is a real tyranny. There is actually another one way down the pike, which is, I think, of some moment. I won't dwell on it right now, but there is, I think, also such a thing as the tyranny of participation. And it needs to be recalled that not everyone who comes by an encampment feels empowered or liberated by the opportunity to participate in the 14-hour meeting. Some of them are people who don't like meetings. Some of them are taking care of children and have other obligations. Way back when Steve and I were young, some of our comrades in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, liked to say that freedom was an endless meeting. Well, some people who'd been to a lot of schooling and liked both sessions might have agreed, and people who were unemployed might also have agreed, but most people didn't. But that one is not what we have to deal with directly. So I think it follows from this principle, from the anti-absolutism, that horizontality, as it's been called, is a good principle, is a sound principle for all kinds of social organization, because it's self-limiting in the sense that Jonathan mentioned. It limits the ability of any one or persons, clumps, groups, networks to dominate others. So, I mean, that's sort of simple but elementary. Now, I think there are two approaches to goals, let's say lifetime goals, so let's say the lifetimes of the youngest people in the room. What are reasonable ways of thinking or sensible ways of thinking about goals? And I think there are essentially two sides of this street that are different but do not necessarily diverge.
And Todd, you have 1 minute for each of the two.
Okay, here they are. One, the creation of institutions which are prefigurations of good life. No system. Many people have pointed this out. No social system disappears until there's something ready to become another social system. I mean, you don't set up a social system the way you manufacture a bottle. Sort of when it's you build one and then you build another one. No, it already exists. We're not talking about creating a constitution. We're talking about creating a society. The people who create a society are people who live in a society. And it happens that they live in the old society until year zero when they decide that they're living in a new society. Counter institutions. Secondly, there are reforms that deeply matter by way of being conditions for democracy. The principles are, in my view, they are reforms that open up possibilities for democracy. One thing plainly that's required is that money be taken out of politics. That's an essential. That's not an incidental reform. That is fundamental. As long as Sheldon Adelson can buy the candidacy of Newt Gingrich for a couple of weeks, and then his wife can buy him another couple of weeks, this is a farce. But there are other such reforms. There are reasons why we should value pensions. There are reasons why we should value insurance. There are reasons why there should be progressive taxation of wealth. I'm not up for absolute equality for various reasons, but obviously the principle is serious. And reforms of that sort will require multiplicity of tactics, working in all kinds of fields, none of which ought to be thrown into the outer darkness, consigned into the outer darkness as forms of co-optation. Because the world we want to change is the world in which we live and in which other people live and in which they have commitments and desires and dreams. And if we really are embedded in the 99%, this is going to be a very arduous, difficult, and intricate process of many different flavors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Todd and I did not coordinate, but I agree very much. So I'm going to amplify actually that last minute. I'm a professor here at the New School, and I want to welcome everybody here, and I want to thank my colleague, Jim, thank you, for organizing this with Lawrence. So thanks a lot for this. We do have a very expensive education. The degree costs a lot, but this is free. So welcome to our space, and I'm glad we're here. I'm very proud and moved to be here. I'm also here because I want to give tribute to the Occupy movement. In the space where I operate, which is economic policy, the Occupy has changed those negotiations and those visions. I was in South Africa during break, and I got off the plane and went to Boca Raton to speak to over 2,000 hedge fund managers and private equity managers. And that was in a resort at Boca Raton, and it was protested. It was picketed by Occupy activists. And I was so grateful because when I walked into the room for my plenary, 1,000 people I spoke to, I got to have a space to say things I normally wouldn't have said. And so I thank you for that. And that space is about how do we share, all of us. I was speaking to the 0.1%, not the 1%, but 0.1%. What is our vision? What are the folks out there? What are the cops that are protecting us and them? What are the hotel workers who aren't unionized? I mentioned that to them. Talking about. So there was a platform on which we could all share a vision. That's why we're here on the panel. And that is I'll give you the language, shared prosperity. This is the idea that shared prosperity is practical, and it's also achievable, and it's also desirable. That's what the South Africans are now talking about, 15 years away from their revolution. Should we nationalize the mines or not nationalize them? How do we correct for the inequality? It's the highest in the world. Is it a means, or is it actually a goal to have a more equitable societies? And those are very real discussions. So those are the kinds of things I talked about to the 0.1%, is that we're in this together, and we have to actually have a method for ultimate goals. And I also said, I actually have 5 things to say. This is the second, and I mostly say that to give you hope when I say this is the fourth. The second point is that we can look back to our past, and really a recent past, about what a narrative, a vision narrative would look like. And it's not the Clinton administration or Carter, but it really goes back to Nixon. There we came off the 60s and had a number of very important federal policies that really parallel in terms of revolution and changing what American worker households could expect, much more dramatic than the New Deal programs. Because the Nixon administration were facing lots of protests, and it wasn't just marches, but it was also picket lines and sit-down strikes and sit-downs, sit-ins, and strikes. We had a labor movement who represented 25% of workers at the time, but 35 and 40% of workers in key value-adding industrial sectors. Because of that environment, that platform negotiations, we got a minimum wage that brought full-time workers up above the poverty line. We haven't hit that since. We had major reforms in occupational safety and health programs. We had a dialogue about what social insurance would be, this insurance that if you're in a capitalist system, but for some reason you can't earn money, there's actually an insurance for that. So I'm going to harken back to those times, right in the 60s and 70s, when we had a program that incidentally narrowed the inequality, but actually led to an economic and social structure for growth. And then we could talk about growth extending to developing countries, and we could have a platform to talk about achieving Millennium Development Goals. Third, I'd like to give you a story about what we might ask for. So here it goes. Why don't we ask for a 25% increase in public school education, that we would extend the school day and the school year by 25%. The reason why that's an imaginative goal is that it's very concrete. It would also expand employment for people at the top, principals and teachers, and people at the very bottom for janitors. It would be one policy that would actually help the labor market inequality. It would also, of course, invest in children. That leaves a platform with ultimate goals that everybody reaches their human potential. But it doesn't work unless, and I would sound like Charles Murray to say that the goal is to improve children's childhood education. That doesn't work unless adults are home to send in the morning to send the child to school. We need a shared vision for full employment and jobs. We have platforms for that. Employer of last resort could be a way to do it. So we do need, when we talk about Occupy, to talk about ultimate goals, expand education and expand employment. The fourth thing I want to say is that it really is hard to underestimate how odd and unusual this economic situation is. We've had a slow and steady increase in the profit share in the economy. And we have reached shares of profits. It's now 44% is the corporate profit share of national income. We haven't reached those.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that out of the gross domestic product, we can attribute that income going to owners of capital, and the other going to labor income. And the share going to profits, dividends, interest, and rents is the highest it's been since 1929. It's a very unusual time period, a very unusual business cycle. That is because of the Bush administration's continuation of the Clinton administration's enabling of financial speculation. Much of it is because of what we decided our economy was going to grow on, which was actually a growth in the financial sector, down the street. So we live not in usual times, but in unusual times. A much more important vision of America is what we achieved in economic policy, and after the 60s, in the 1970s. So fifth, the last thing I want to say, and to actually emphasize the point, not only did profit share increase, but also the top 1% of households, you know all this, spurned the slogan, increased its after-tax share of income from 8% to 17%. It almost doubled after-tax income. So it wasn't just the income going to the financial speculators that increased it. It was our tax policy that also increased it. Now that means that the top 1% garners looks like over $1 trillion of income. If you tax that by 10%, you yield in just 1 year $100 billion. So not only do we need growth policies, but we also do need redistribution policies. But to go back to where I started, the Occupy movement that is attendant to a labor movement does set the stage not for, I don't think, awakening matters, but really serious negotiations between equal parties. This is a necessary movement for more negotiations, and with that, I think we can get more shared prosperity. That's my ultimate goal.
Thank you. Marina?
Okay. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I go with the awakening, but I think the awakening is our power. And I think we need to take it more seriously. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. I think our movements have a critique that is systemic. I think that's a part of what Occupy is about. And for various reasons, maybe we don't talk about it, or maybe we're not totally aware. But inherent in some of our politics is this critique of the system. And in what we do and what we're creating, I think we're creating alternatives to capitalism as well. Not absolutely, but we can see in certain practices that I'm going to talk about where we're going a bit beyond in a form of alternative value production. So this is kind of we must take ourselves more seriously part of this, our power and our social relationships. And that reforms, of course, are good, but that we have to go further. And I think if people were to twinkle, we'd probably get some twinkles on that. So, the base of that is our prefigurative forms, the directly democratic forms, the assemblies, and that's where we begin to imagine what democracy could look like. But we can't have democracy with capitalism. We could make more representation, I think, but democracy and capitalism don't work together. So starting with this kind of forms of new social relationships as a base, the horizontalidad as a social relationship, we can start to look to new ways of being and doing, I think, against and beyond capitalism. So what does that look like, creating this other value? And it's not to be naive, and I only have a few more minutes, so the question of the state and violence and all of these incredibly important questions, we have to talk about. I'm not going to pretend that that's just some kind of bracket or footnote or something. But in the right now, I think if we're just to look at some of our practices in the movements, for example, the occupying of homes, we're not actually, as a movement, making demands saying, make this person's mortgage better. We're taking over the home and saying, there's a whole other value system at play here. We're not going to play with your value system of make it better capitalism, nicer market value. We're going to take over the home and this person's not going to pay. And this, in Greece, what they started to do, they had free healthcare. They've now made it so people have to pay for healthcare. And some of the neighborhood assemblies, because they're no longer in Stadagma Square, they're more in neighborhoods throughout Athens in particular, what they decided to do is to take over the cashiers within the hospitals. So the question of paying for your healthcare or not is not even up to that individual. So it's changing the whole conversation about what's at value, it's human life. It's not saying make it cheaper. Of course, the movements don't want to pay for healthcare, and that would be part of what they're organizing towards. It's not a zero engagement with the state, but it's also a going beyond and creating a different kind of value there. The same thing with the stopping the evictions in Spain. It's a form of action that's producing a different kind of value that's about solidarity and taking care of each other. And this is, again, that let's take ourselves seriously when we look at what we're doing, that we are producing alternatives in a different way of looking at value that's about human life and solidarity, and it's outside of these other terms of capitalist production value, I think. One little example I also want to give, it's not little, it's actually massive. I lived in Argentina after the economic crisis in 2001. That's actually where we get our horizontalidad from, as people started using it in Argentina, and then we've now started to use it all over the world. This social relationship of breaking down power. They talk about it as a tool and a goal, but I'm not going to talk about horizontalidad now. I'm going to talk about one of the many, many things that came out of this crisis and people together in horizontal ways coming up with alternatives was the taking over of workplaces. So there are now over 300 workplaces that have been recuperated. And recuperated is the word people use in Argentina in Spanish, meaning we are taking back something that is ours, can be implicit in that. They're not occupied, and I think it's really important to make that point, even though some people refer to them as occupied. That's not how the workers refer to the process. They're recuperating. And they're workplaces because they're health clinics, they're schools, they're newspapers, they're hotels. It's not just your traditional factory. But what we can see in these workplaces in Argentina is the decisions people are making, the workers. As they're recuperating and running these workplaces, they're not in their assemblies deciding how can we be the most productive in capitalist terms. They're surviving, and that's really important. But then they have a whole other way of thinking about what they do, which is based on solidarity. And it's based on, for example, if a workplace is going to be evicted, which often happens, workers in one workplace will decide to release people to go and support workers in another. Now, that's not the most productive. You're not going to make the most money in the workplace if you release workers all the time to support other workers. But in solidarity terms, it is and it's something different. It's this other kind of production of value that we can see the seeds of. The same thing in using the workplaces as community centers when they could perhaps be producing in that moment, but they're not. They're using them for schools, for clinics, for all kinds of other things. So we see it in a massive way in Argentina that I think could be one of the many, many things that we borrow, like horizontalidad, around the world. And to end on an exciting step in Greece just this week. A hospital was recuperated by the workers, and they're using the word recuperated, and they plan to run it and make it open to the community and keep it free, and they're using horizontal assemblies. And all of this relationship and what people are doing, both the forms of relating to one another and how we're creating this alternative, and in what we're doing. This does not end capitalism in itself, but these are things that we can be doing now in creating alternative ways of relating to one another that begin to push beyond ways of thinking in capitalist market terms and a different kind of value term. And then we can have a bigger conversation about the state and violence and how they respond. But as a beginning part of the conversation, we need to take ourselves, I think, more seriously, because we are much further than I think we are.
Thank you. So let's start with comments from the other panelists. Anybody want? Let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Lerner, and I haven't spoken, so I feel compelled being on a panel. I should say something, though. I'm not sure I have something so brilliant to say. So in the labor movement, which is where I've spent my life, I often am the one that says, well, we're not thinking big enough and we need to have more of a vision. And then here at this table, I feel like I must be some kind of pork chopper or something because I'm just like this practical guy that's saying, so what happens next? So I'm going to try to draw a line between the two, which a little bit is what I'll say later. But I think everybody's, and this is the risk of pissing everybody off by saying everybody, when not everybody's saying this, but there seems to be a little bit of it's one or the other here in everything. You're for violence, you're against it, you're for grand vision, or you're for reform. And I want to throw out that maybe it's the intersection between some of the horizontal and the more traditional vertical organizations that takes us to critical mass and the possibility of building a movement that's broad enough to win really, really big change. And I think the danger here sometimes is we define ourselves as either being for transactional negotiations, I want a quarter an hour at work, or for transformational change in capitalism. And I think in the real life of organizing workers, we have to do both simultaneously. And I'll give a specific example in terms of, you brought up Occupy Homes, which I'm spending a lot of time on, that it takes different forms in different places. And in some cases, it's about liberation of homes. But in Watts, it is very much about physically stopping eviction and renegotiating what the mortgage is so people can stay. And that it's part of, the number's actually pretty incredible. More homes have been destroyed through foreclosure than were in the riots. And so I guess what I want to throw out here is I think there's an interesting way to think about how we do both at once that lets us scale, which is a question I've been obsessed with my whole life, is how do we do things that are breakthroughs, that are excited, that let us reimagine how the country operates, the world operates, and how do we do them in a way that potentially they're reproducible enough? And so the Occupy the Homes piece, which I think is so exciting about it, is it marries the spirit of occupation, but in fact there is a demand that could be won, which is that $700 billion in negative equity should be wiped out, which, not transformational, but actually would not be a bad thing. If it would reduce the average mortgage in the country $432 a month, it would create 1 million jobs, et cetera, and it would be, but more than the narrow, we could call it narrow victory there, is I think it lets us say we could take on the biggest, most powerful institutions in the history of the world and flip the contradictions of capitalism on them so that they have to do something that both is good for us and weakens them. So I don't know where that fits in, but I think we can do both at the same time.
Yotam?
Yeah. I want to skip back to the sort of the question of this panel, I guess, about ultimate goals and stuff like that. I think I hear a lot about, I want to just push that conversation another step further. I actually think it's incredibly important for us to develop vision and for it to be coherent and for us to really engage with that question beyond saying that we need to have vision. I think we need to actually debate what that other world would look like, and I think there might be some agreement about that, and I want to kind of like make an extra sort of plug for that. I think that vision is really necessary because I think it's really hard to really put it on the line if you don't have some sort of idea of what you might have on the other side. And I also think that our vision is what informs the way that we struggle. So I know that I want to create models of participatory democracy in our struggle because I want that kind of society when we win it. But I think it's really important to look really, really far ahead, even at the risk of the criticism about blueprints. I mean, I don't think we need to have an exact sketch of who does what and who says what and all that stuff in a free society, but I do think we have a responsibility to creatively imagine and dream up the institutions of a free society. I think that starts with an analysis, with a really careful analysis of the systems of repression that we face. I think that goes beyond capitalism and authoritarianism. I think that needs to include patriarchy and white supremacy and imperialism, and the way all of those things affect ecology. And I think that we then need to really dream up the values of the world that we want to live, and then think of the institutions that would allow us to carry out those values. And some of those values might be equity, solidarity, self-management, etc. And then I really do think it's our responsibility to start to think about institutions. I think councils, for example, I would say I don't need to wait another 100 years for us to be in the position to say we need councils. No, like I think every revolutionary movement in history, probably since the French Revolution, maybe more. I'm not a historian. I just made that up. Has developed in one form or another, systems of self-governance for the purpose of social transformation and self-governance of the things that we win when we win them. And I feel pretty confident that I want a society where people have councils or assemblies both in their neighborhoods and in their workplaces so that they can collectively plan the social, economic, and political institutions of their lives. And I feel comfortable saying that, and I think we need to say even more than that maybe and engage in that question. So I kind of wanted to just put that out there, I guess.
Jim, I'd like to press a little bit on this because the whole question of ultimate goals. And this conversation is reminding me a little bit, it was the French Revolution that triggered this, of Condorcet. And Condorcet wrote what became the Jacobin Constitution that was never implemented, which for its time and place was a radically democratic institution. It's a document that rallied the Chartists in the 1840s. Condorcet also happens to be one of the geniuses who thought about paradoxes of voting rules, and he also thought about the problems of social insurance. He was a forerunner of statistics and how you distribute risk and accidents in society. I bring him up because Condorcet, if you go look at this Constitution, it's a sort of what it proposes is a set of nested General Assemblies, that it goes from a very local level, but it keeps going and going because he assumes that somewhere there has to be a center that is aggregating data over a regional area which then generates a state that ostensibly is democratic and it has a horizontal dimension, but it's also vertical. And it is this state in the pinnacle that is charged with figuring out pension, social insurance, redistribution of wealth, and also of enforcing, because he assumes, like David Graeber does, that in a free society people won't always agree with each other. Therefore, you need an umpire to assure a peaceful modus vivendi. He assumes when you get to a large enough scale, consensus will be impossible because people will hold incommensurable values. But it drove him to assume that in order to achieve freedom and genuine democracy, you needed to have some form of state. So it seems to me many of the proposals we've talked about take for granted. Of course there is a central authority, what Teresa was talking about, what Steve Lerner was talking about. So maybe it's that's just a transitional moment. But it seemed, the question I suppose I would put back to David Graeber is, aren't there certain foreseeable problems, this has nothing to do with the blueprint, of scale and the scalability of collective freedom that pose challenges to simply to the anarchist dream of abolishing the state?
Do you want me to directly answer that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I like to say that when we talk about anarchist forms of organization, anarchism can embrace any form of organization at all that doesn't depend on being able to call up some guys with weapons at a certain point to say, everybody shut up and do what you're told. I don't care what you have to say about this. Any sort of organization that would not require that, could be an anarchist form of organization. In terms of incommensurability, actually, that's what I actually take issue with you, because one of consensus process as it has emerged from the 70s at least, and maybe this is the breakthrough that it really comes out of feminism, I think, has been basically about the problem of how you come up to compromises between incommensurable positions, which is something which in theory you can't do, but in theory bumblebees can't fly. It's the same kind of thing. People do it every day. That's what you do all day long, is come up with compromises between, when you cook a meal, the healthiness versus the ease of making it versus the taste, are incommensurables, yet you compromise between them all the time. That's what life actually consists of. So in a way, what people have been trying to do is come up with a form of democracy that can do that. Now, so I don't think you need a systematic bureaucracy of violence in order to overcome the problem of how to compromise between incommensurables. You just agree on principles of things that you want to have in common, and you actually try to listen to each other and assume that you're never going to actually win someone over, and you wouldn't want to. It's a little like Hobbes and Herder. Hobbes is saying, well, there would be a war of all against all because everybody wants the same thing because they're all the same. Herder's saying, no, they're going to be pursuing different values, so they're all going to go off to different corners of the world and be interested in different things and maybe have contempt for one another. Why would they fight? In a way, incommensurability could create greater possibilities for peace. I would distinguish between, large complex structures that go beyond simply assemblies, which of course will have to exist in a million different forms, and a state, which is a systematic bureaucracy of violence.
If I could press you on that, we would like to have local participatory democracy just because that's the scale that you can have it at. Mm-hmm. So all of us here are having our little local participatory democracy, and all the millionaires in Purchase are having their little participatory democracy. How do we get the money from the people in Purchase here unless you do have a strong state along the lines that Teresa's talking about, where you are able to tax? They're just in practice, if you are trying to keep democracy local, the problem is going to be that right now local places have completely different standards of living.
Right, we're talking about different time scales. That's why I started by saying in order to have a democratic society, we would have to massively change the economic order.
So you do that
now
first?
We're talking how to get there.
But that's an interesting argument, because if you're saying you have to do that first, then it may not be time to have participatory democracy right now. You may need to be having strong government that has strong wealth taxes and that's representative democracy. That means that if you take that seriously, Occupy Wall Street should be trying to elect representatives who will do that and defeat representatives who wouldn't. I'm not necessarily saying they should, but I'm just saying, how do you get out of that paradox?
I thought Marina answered that.
No, I'm actually not going to answer it at all. I'm going to suggest, because there's so many Occupy folks here, that we start a conversation that's general, because the question of governance and the state and representation and all of these things are so massive that all of us, in the spirit of democracy, if we begin the conversation and then we'll put pressure on David in the end for the wrap-up, maybe?
Yeah. You're skipping to number 3.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Or if there's other people who want to still speak.
Well, why don't we start inviting people up here, and while they're coming, are there any other comments on this particular?
Just actually to follow up what you said, Rin, somebody mentioned Hannah Arendt before. Hannah Arendt who was a great theorist of councils, got in a lot of trouble in 1957, I believe, by writing an article opposing the use of federal force to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. I think is actually her worst moment, but it points to a very significant theoretical question, which is exactly the one you raised, which is, if nobody from the outside is going to enforce racial integration, who is?
Mm-hmm. So let's begin to invite people. We'll start here and then go over there.
In the interest of my own nervousness and time, I have a list of notes, and I'm just going to read them and a couple points, and I'll try and summarize.
2 minutes.
All right, got it. You're talking about we can't have democracy without capitalism, but no one's talking about what is capitalism. And that's a really important question. Economists often don't talk about it. I'll also identify myself. I'm Alexandria. I'm an economist, a student at the New School for Social Research. And That's a really big question, and it's easy to talk about economists as though they're the bad guys, but also know that you have a bastion of hope out at the Social Research School, trying very hard to help do these things with Teresa there. Okay, and part of what capitalism is this tyranny of capital. It's the idea of profit, but the problem is not that people are seeking profit necessarily. It's that you need profit to do things. You need money in order to have power. You need money to buy health. You need money to buy food, and you need money to stay in business, and you need money in our electoral process. And so that seems like the biggest part that we need to take out if we're going to try and have democracy. But also that's a cultural problem. It's not, we talk about economic and we talk about political problems, but we also have a cultural problem. And the cultural problem is that people like to have money in their pockets. We have this buffer culture. We have a whole bunch of empty seats in the middle and a whole bunch of people who are standing because we have this buffer culture, and we need to be really specific about investigating ourselves as well as the 1%. And we need to investigate our language in terms of having a participatory kind of conversation, because it's not just where is the money, it's what happens if we do redistribute the money, then what happens? Because going back to Teresa's point of a shared prosperity, well, that's when we can do things like Marina is talking about, where we can have these places that everyone comes to, that are where we have like our health centers, our school centers, where we can maximize how much schooling we do. And that's the shared prosperity. And the other thing that happens when you talk about economics and politics instead of culture is that we hide behind this idea of equality of wealth, when instead what we need to be talking about is equality of opportunity. And that's the problem that we're running into here, is no one here so far has said that we want exact wealth equality. That's not important to us at all. Do we need to redistribute wealth? Sure. But the problem is this lack of opportunity. And to think about, simple things like, what do we have here all as academics? Like the people who are sitting at the table, like, you have your academics, and so awesome, you get to talk about it. Or you come from different places. There's a lot of great things that have happened here. And then also thinking about, of all the women at the table, only one of them's in jeans. Or like just all these little tiny things. Or two of them are in jeans. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. And just all these little things that even though we're on the side of the right, or, the left, but even though like we can have this sort of I'm over 2 minutes anyway, it's just really important to keep it in terms of this. It's not just an economic conversation, it's a cultural conversation, and to be really reflective that our charisma gives us a lot more weight than our ideas sometimes, and we need to have a little bit of balance for that.
Thank you. Over here. We'll take two or three and then have comments.
My name is Harriet Coram, and I'm from Cape Cod. I'm also active with 350.org. And I just wanted to raise the question of, as a goal, having a planet that's hospitable to us and to our grandchildren and children, and that put in a word for this leaderless movement that has its prophets, including Bill McKibben and Vandana Shiva, and also Jonathan Schell, but that has taken inspiration from the Occupy movement. And I just wanted to say, as a goal, I think we have to remember that goal of working on this stuff, and that this movement has been energized by nonviolent direct action, which I was fortunate to be part of. And I think that it's a tremendous, whatever you say about it, it's a tremendous, powerful force for bringing new people in. And I also want to just thank the Occupy movement, people that are here and who've been doing all this work. And just to say that I'm looking forward to what happens next. And I hope that it takes inspiration from people like the Council of Elders, who worked with Martin Luther King and worked with the Civil Rights Movement, who are with you and with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patrick O'Donnell, and I was just wondering if you could maybe address a couple of assumptions which may not be self-evident to people who are not part of Occupy Wall Street. And one of those is, why is direct participatory democracy better than a representative democracy or any other system of government for that matter? Because certainly one can imagine the direct participatory democracy making as bad decisions as representative democracy or another system. And then the second would be, why capitalism is incompatible with democracy, or not even just capitalism, but any kind of economic system. Do you have to have a particular kind of economic system with a particular kind of democracy? Thanks.
Thank you. Why don't we start with that? Jonathan, you want to address that first?
Just one comment about direct democracy. I think the great thing about direct democracy is precisely its directness, that people are taking action immediately and in the first instance in their own communities and expressing themselves and so acting. You might think of representative democracy as detour democracy. In other words, you first appoint somebody and you have to create a vast distance between the citizen and the representative, who then becomes the actor, and the citizen is depoliticized. But within, between the cup and the lip there comes the super PAC. And so it's very corruptible. And the lack of vitality means that it's much easier to corrupt than would be the case, it seems to me, if you were able to conceive and then found something that was more directly democratic.
David?
Yeah, I mean, direct democracy is superior to participatory democracy because people should have control over their own lives. I think it's hard for us to think because we think of a language as created by 200 years of propaganda. I mean, if you go back to the discussions of the creation of the constitutions, they were really explicit. They said, well, there's three principles. There's democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. Democracy is the worst system. We're not going to have that. We're going to have something with small democratic elements, but it's basically an aristocratic with a monarchical element in the president. So rather than say, and this system was called a republic. In the 1830s, like Andrew Jackson said, I'm a Democrat because the franchise wide enough that people liked the idea of democracy. And he won. And the same thing happened in France. The same thing happened in Canada. People started calling themselves Democrats. Within 5 years, everybody was calling themselves a Democrat. And they simply relabeled the system, which was created to stop democracy, as a democracy. And that's the system that we've got. It's a system that was created to prevent popular participation. It was, electoral system was self-consciously an aristocratic mode where we get these specialists and select which is supposed to be the best of them to think for us. No, if you think that's okay, that these guys really are the equivalent of aristocrats, the politicians that run our country, or could be, well, okay, yeah, then maybe it's not the greatest system. I mean, maybe that's the best system, but we have to talk about what's really going on here.
Is it possible to imagine a representative system that would be better or that could be effective?
No, I mean, I think the solution that has come up with, there's two things that are interesting. I mean, until the 1770s, everybody agreed that election was the aristocratic system and that the democratic system was lottery. Sortition, like jury duties, basically. They would give people screening. If you're, except jury duties is mandatory. Anybody who puts their name in the hat, give them a basic test. If they pass the test, pick their name from a hat. All the people who passed the test. And that's what they did in Florence. That's what they did in Athens. There's a million other ways to do it. There's the sort of Zapatista recallable delegates. You have somebody there with a specific charge. It's not a representative in that same sense, but they're a delegate of a group.
I say this in the context of I say this in the context of a planet that has, what is it, 9 billion people now, or 8 billion?
Yeah.
And I say that in the context of the woman who asked that one of the major tasks of these 8 billion people is to find some way for their grandchildren to live on a habitable planet, and whether we can really imagine that a straight participatory democracy can do that, or whether perhaps lottery or something else has to be thought about.
Well, again, there's a million different principles that can be recombined, but the system we have isn't really solving the problem at all.
I agree with you completely about that. Yeah. Okay. Did other people's responses to some of the things that were?
I just wanted to make sure that this gentleman right here got an opportunity to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, a few other comments about what has been said already, and then we're going to have...
Is there time for another round of questions?
There will be.
Okay. Or another round from the audience?
Yeah, there is definitely going to be.
I wonder I wanted to go back to the beginning. There's a lot of really great things that have been said, and I agree with Stephen Lerner that it's not really an either-or. I think of something this big as being like an ecosystem, and it's not like, do you want tigers or do you want butterflies? You want an ecosystem. You want people who are working for better schools. And you've got crises. I mean, people are starving, people are going homeless right away, and that's often going to be addressed through reformatory and small measures, but you need big picture activism too. So it's another kind of binary to be either or. But I also think that maybe it's not about goals, which are something over there we're not at yet, but this really amazing process that's been going on all my life, this being such an era of revolution and thinking about gender and identity and power and everything else, that's really accelerated in some beautiful ways, that maybe it's not about goals but about definitions. When you redefine things, new possibilities emerge. If you define that capitalism and democracy are incompatible, different things emerge. If you define that actually we're so powerful that the 1%, the government, et cetera, are terrified of us, then other possibilities emerge. And if you get past Margaret Thatcher's "there is no alternative" and start to talk about those alternatives, then other things emerge. One thing that I think that and we start to talk about them. Something David's spoken about really eloquently, or written about really eloquently in the past, is the sense that we're all anarchists. I think it's David. Correct me, or if there's time. That in a sense we're all anarchists now. That our default assumptions are that we don't like hierarchies, we don't like domination, we don't like the authoritarianism of violence. And somebody at Occupy Wall Street a while back said we're fighting for a world in which everybody is valuable. I think that's maybe the ultimate goal, ultimate definition. But what does that look like? Is a question. But I also feel that another revolution that's been going on very powerfully in the last decade is a revolution in how we think about human nature. I've become a scholar of disaster because disaster is where you contest the assumption that we're essentially creatures of selfish, social, Darwinist, competitive, chaotic, stupid disaster movie behavior. And in fact, people in disasters behave very altruistically, generously, improvisationally. It unfolds like a revolution. So I feel like also what's with us all being anarchists now, with what's going on, we're involved in this massive process of a fundamental redefinition of human nature, and that these redefinitions are not goals, they're processes that sort of bring us to new places which we could define as goals, except that in some ways we're already there, but we're awakening to them in some very exciting ways. And I wish I could talk about climate change too, which I think is sort of the most important thing in the world, but there's way too much to talk about because this is way too exciting historical moment. And way too big a panel and way too short and et cetera. But anyway.
Teresa, you want to go?
No, let's just go on.
Okay. Let's bring in a few more. Let's start with you.
My name is Yitzhak Epstein. I'll try to be brief. This talk about consensus. It works, yes, in the Clemson Alliance, where everybody shares values and has been working together. In some Quaker communities, where everybody is practically family, etc. In Occupy Wall Street, give me a break. I've been there. No. Excuse me. Nothing wrong with Occupy Wall Street because of that. It's just built on the false assumption that we are sufficiently cohesive, sufficiently homogeneous for the consensus process to work for us. I'll not go there. Similarly, the issue of councils as a model for community. I've been to such things, and you know what? It is for those who decide to participate, among those who have the best skills to dominate. There are shortcomings. I'm not against all of the things. There is a need for it. I will not go into the difference between participatory democracy and direct democracy, which are not the same, but I'll skip that. One more thing that has been touched on, but it is important. As far as goals and vision, the planet, and us, and our species, and other species, and our communities. There is among us those who believe that unless we become hunter-gatherers very soon, and even if we don't want to, that's what we will become because of the disaster to come. We will become hunter-gatherers, and then the other understanding of where we are headed is false, Jensen, etc. And then those who believe that we need a sustainable environment and sustainable communities, etc., etc., etc. I will not cross the T's and dot the I's, but the Tea Party is now mobilizing against something that the UN came up with in the 90s called Agenda 21 and so forth, and that is supportive of us going towards sustainable communities and sustainable development. But we are ignoring that. I'm on the sustainable community side because I do not want my grandchildren to become hunter-gatherers. But I'll stop here because other people have to talk.
Just one quick question from you. What do you mean by the difference between direct and participatory democracy? Just in 2 or 3 sentences.
Can do it better because he was there. Direct democracy means that we minimize representative democracy and we make decisions with the human beings coming together and deciding, and maybe we have some pyramidal where we send some people to a spokes council, whatever that is, etc., etc. This is direct democracy. Participatory democracy said it's not instead of the political system, but we should have power to decide things that affect us, like our children's schooling when we are parents, like our workplace when we are workers, and on those things there should be some democratic mechanism. That's my understanding. Okay. I may be wrong.
Okay. Thank you. Do we want to? This was a rather do you want to just respond to him quickly before we go to the next one?
No, actually, I want to open another can of worms.
Okay. I'll hold off on. But does anybody on the panel want to say respond to the whole that people have to agree with each other before you can have that otherwise you get into the thing where. Yeah.
Well, this is, I think, one of the places where there is a limit to direct democracy and participatory democracy, because if you have a group of people that are in a locality, and let's assume they're extremely altruistic, they're very communal, et cetera, there's a question of how do you think about further generations? How do you think about what other little communities are doing elsewhere that might have an impact on the decisions you're making? And that kind of global perspective is, and also intergenerational perspective is, I think, difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to articulate with direct local councils. It's the kind of case where it seems to me this is the kind of problem that it's at such a global scale that as I try to think about it and think about people who try to think about the best way to approach these problems, you probably want multiple diverse kinds of structures, some horizontal, some vertical. But
David, did you want to?
Can I actually send it? People have been standing for a while. I would suggest we just take more.
Let's
and also, there's some people who. And there's also some people who stood on line last time or at the back of this line who maybe should move forward.
Was there anybody who was in line last time? They should come to the front of the lines. But keep going.
Hi, my name is Bruce Airman. I've had a need and occasion to speak to a number of occupiers, and I was really intrigued by sort of a sense that I got from a lot of them that a Catalonian model of anarcho-syndicalism was their sort of dream for the future. And I love the way they speak very much of process, or at least they did 2 or 3 months ago. But my first action was Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, and when I was 15, my brother dragged me into SDS and then SWP. And at that time, and for the next 10 years, I had no idea that Dubček and Svoboda could be crushed like mosquitoes, or that the democratically elected government of Allende could be crushed like a mosquito, or that the socialist communard government of Israel could turn into such a far right-wing institution that even basic women's rights are now in question, or that we, and I say we because it was an international movement, could actually cause Charles de Gaulle to remove himself from France, and we had nothing to put in his place, so he flew back. or that Reagan could begin the destruction of 60 years of some kind of reformism in this country that started, I don't know, with the Wobblies. And I could go on with a list of disappointments. And, Yotam talking about thinking of actual conclusive goals seems really, really important to me. And I just was hoping we could address that a little more. Something in addition to process, wondering what you see is protective of this movement's future.
Bring down the microphone here.
Hi. Okay,
Stay
so
close to the microphone.
Okay, so I'm a state student. I go to Rutgers. I'm an anthropology and philosophy double major. So I really like to break things down. So one thing that my friends and I have been keenly aware of is the othering that occurs between the academic structure and the hoarding of, it's not really hoarding, but the fact that the academic structure itself is a product of capitalism itself is a little problematic for us because we feel like the next generation is growing up with shifting ideas of what they consider, of their values. And one of the facilitators of this, we feel, is the internet. So, something that we've been working on is trying to actually free up knowledge in terms of blogging, and it's a little absurd because at the same time, I get my knowledge through the very institution of which I'm keenly critical of. And it's tough because this is the transitional moment, right? Like we're trying to transition away from capitalism, yet we're all still products and conditioned by capitalism. So, one of a question that I just want to throw out there is like, how do we promote the very values with which we want to embody by like living it? You know what I mean? Like, if we want equality, egalitarianism, that also includes like freedom of ideas and such. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Let's take over here.
Well, I'm getting videotaped pretty close here, so I think I'm more nervous about the pixelated blemishes. But I really wanted to recall what the previous commenter said about culture. I don't think that was addressed up here. I think one of the biggest adversaries Occupy has is the American dream. I think it's a well-funded idea. I think it's keeping poor people in the cities rapping about cars, and it's keeping poor people in the countries buying guns and protecting their properties. I mean, this cultural dilemma, I think, is really crucial because I think the real problem here is we're representing people who aren't representing themselves. And I think the American dream is a notion that's perpetuating that. So I just wonder what you guys would have to say about that.
Why don't we take a break in collecting questions and?
Should we just take these last two questions because we've got three people left. Do we
Yeah,
have
let's
time?
have the last one.
Okay.
Let's stack it.
Maybe if they're fast, because.
Okay. As long as we get back to, we have been given a charge to answer a lot of these questions. Okay.
Hey guys, thanks. This is a question that I had from the previous panel, so I hope this isn't taking us back too far. I feel like it is still kind of relevant. One of the things that I really appreciate about the last panel was the unpacking of a lot of the buzzwords that have been used in the last few weeks, violence, specifically. And I was wondering if you thought it was relevant and would be interested in unpacking the word solidarity, because it seems like that word is being thrown around a lot. It's, in a way, like not really clear if it's a strategy or a principle. And I think clarifying that is really important for moving forward.
Hi, I'm Sun Young here from the New School. I have two quick questions, one for David, another one for Teresa, please. So for David, I was wondering whether or not you would be open to reformulating what you called creating socioeconomic conditions for democracy to saying, in the spirit of the distinction that was raised between participatory and direct democracy, to creating democracy in the social realm, in the economic realm. And I ask this because I hear a nuance which worries me that you may not necessarily intend when you say that, we need to create conditions or economic conditions beyond which people could go to pursue their desires or needs. And I feel like this somehow presupposes a certain denigration of labor and active working. So that was the question for you. And for Teresa, I would like to challenge your I think faith in the idea of the possibility of shared prosperity. And I feel like you take inspiration and confidence in this by going back to the Nixon administration, by actually looking at historical epochs within capitalism inside the United States and saying that it could be better. And I know Yota mentioned, problems of imperialism in addition to those of race and gender. Now, I find a certain vacillation of between when we, invoke the idea of the 99%, talking about, financial capitalism, I think oftentimes here in the United States, and then jumping many, many levels above and talking about the planet. I think there are many gaps in the middle that we need to fill in, and just one fear that this idea of the 99% may feed into a certain idea of economic nationalism here in the United States, where it just goes into, a debate about, who's getting a larger, part of the pie when you talked, for instance, about the profit versus, the wage ratios of the GDP.
Hi, my name's Marcos de Jesus, and I want to introduce a topic that I haven't heard discussed at all. It's religion as an aspect of people's identities and an aspect of culture. I'm here partly because I'm a union member, partly because I'm a democratic socialist, but fundamentally the thing that gets me up in the morning and the thing that gets me to be an activist is my Christian faith in the liberation tradition of Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King, and I would think Jesus of Nazareth. For me, one thing that was extraordinary about Occupy Wall Street is that I didn't face the type, I've yet to experience the type in Occupy Wall Street events, I've yet to experience the type of prejudice against religious folk that I've been accustomed to experiencing in some progressive and especially radical movements that I've been a part of. Occupy Wall Street fundamentally has done that, I think, because of putting a priority on voluntary participation, not as having that and just allowing people to come as they are and participate as they are. And that little corner at Zuccotti Park that was a sacred space had all kinds of religion up in it, and nobody tried to purge it, and nobody tried to push anybody else's symbol out of there. I think it matters profoundly as we consider ultimate goals, because you can't fight for a future that has no place for you. You can't fight for a future that has no place for you. And there's a strong tradition on the left that secularization is the first step to social progress. And I think that needs to be challenged as a Eurocentric assumption. It worked for Western Europe, maybe in some sense. But in this country, progressive social change, when the huge paradigm shifts have happened, they have included people of faith very often. Abolition, Eugene Jebb's movement, and the civil rights movement as a few examples. So just lastly, I just ask people to consider that I was extremely nervous to come out here as a religious person, coming out of the closet as a religious person. I don't think that's because of any weird thing in my psychology. I think it has to do with some real biases. And I ask folk to consider if we have anti-religion biases and whether or not that's helpful. Thank you.
We have one last person over here, and then we have answers from this group we're expecting. Okay.
Yes, my name is Megan Bowler. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, but I'm originally from San Francisco, so I've had the great opportunity to be at about 5 camps: Oakland, San Francisco, Wall Street, Toronto. Interviewed tons of people at the camps because I've been researching how social media is used for dissent for many, many years. So one thing I just want to raise for the rest of the afternoon is us talking about our relationship to traditional media, as well as the role of social media and the role it's played. I think we have a new form of hybrid movement. We haven't really talked about that, but these are our waning days of access to this, and I'm really concerned about that we have this now, we have this opportunity with social media now, and we may not later. One point I wanted to make, when I get lots of media calls to speak to international, national press, TV news, and they'll often say to me, why are there not any goals? Why has the Occupy movement not stated any goals? We've probably all received that question, and so I found really good ways of answering it by both saying there are goals and also saying something that I've really appreciated here, that the process is so important, and that this organic process and the social relations that it happens, that most of the women have been tending to emphasize that, which is interesting. What's so different from this movement from 1968, for example, I don't see an imposition of preordained blueprint of goals. There has been an organic part of that, which I think is absolutely crucial if this is going to succeed. At the same time, what I've wondered myself is why we can't have both. Why there can't be an honoring of it's not either or, but that this organic process is going to continue and we can't see what that's going to look like. But why we can't at the same time be able to name, for example, to the media where we want, without the spectacle of tents, what's the media going to cover, right? As the spring comes and hopefully things continue. I have a concern about that. So there's been a lot around foreclosure. I'm wondering why the issues of corporate personhood and, like, for example, whether we take that to in terms of the constitutional change or a legislative change or both, I think time spent figuring out, do we have to just do one? I think the strength of this is the different flagships doing different things. Some is about the social relations. Some is about taking these targeted things to DC, or about taxing, exchanges at Wall Street, et cetera. Why can't we have those very specific things? And we are having them. So I just wanted to bring to our attention, what is our relationship to the media? How can we have really specific things so that the media doesn't have to look for the police busting up camps as their spectacle, because we may not have those attention-grabbing things. The other is, how do we protect, for example, Twitter, which is the main source of news and organizing? Finally, we have, for the first time ever in my study of social movements, a global citizen, in a sense. We truly have that through this media, and only because of our social media. And that's something to, quote unquote, capitalize on. It's really crucial.
Okay, thank you. I'd say we have about 5 or 10 minutes from this panel to answer all of those questions, but let's have some of them. David, did you have
There are
anything?
also a few people who haven't spoken yet on the panel.
Oh yeah, why don't we do that?
Yeah, no, we're going to get, so.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the thing about embodying values, especially at a university. I go to Brooklyn College, and what we tried to do is I tried to open a student-run coffee shop on campus, but in order to have a space to organize out of, and I think that at the university level, it's really important to just create your own student-run spaces, as hard as it is to run a business while going to school and organizing. And in response to the thing about culture and Occupy Wall Street is something I think a lot about, because I think that as much as people have been able to kind of latch on to what Occupy Wall Street stands for, a lot of people don't, and I think a lot of it has to do with the culture, and it really does speak to people who feel dejected by middle class America and who feel like they should have had access to the American dream, but people who never had access to the American dream don't, and I think we really need to look at that if we really think we can make this mass movement. That's it.
One thing that's been sort of addressed over and over again is the idea of the binary, and why are we searching for the answer when there is no singular answer. And I think actually someone brought up issues of ecology, and I think as that's what my academic background is in ecology. And I think that diversity and looking at things like an ecosystem is a really smart way to do it. And I think the bottom line is that there aren't answers and there isn't a destination. So I really appreciate what you said about faith and about bringing in people, and it's not just about religious people or not religious people, but I think the movement that I want to see is, I always say, I want to see a movement that looks like a subway car in New York City, like at Union Square, right? It's everyone from everywhere. And that, obviously, we've been talking about how difficult that is when it comes to coming to consensus, which is often why consensus feels super burdensome. And I think so that also, I don't like the term diversity of tactics because we talked about that sort of, it implies something other than what I mean. But what I mean is that I don't think that we need to fetishize any tactic. I don't think consensus needs to be an absolute tactic. I don't think that voting or any other it's not about finding the answer and signing your name under it and then selling a book about it. It's about recognizing context and saying, in this situation, in this moment, what works for us, right? And so I think a lot of times, and I know I'm all over the place, but back to the religious part, I tend to be really kind of grossed out sometimes by the culture of the left, the academic, what was also referenced, culture of who can say something more eloquently, who has written more about this, who has gotten into what magazine, and we're talking about the struggle in a way that's completely inaccessible to the people who are living the struggle, right? So for the people who are most marginalized, sometimes I feel like talks like this are, I'm not trying to be offensive here, but sometimes I feel like a forum of this type is irrelevant to the people who are most affected by the issues that this is addressing. And I think that's a fundamental problem that needs to be addressed, just like this young woman brought up. You know, you have to go to university, you have to go to college to understand why it's so messed up, you know? So, and that's a really big problem, right? Like, it's not until you get to college that you feel like you really understand the nuances of all the things that have been used against you in your life. So, like some of my favorite writers ever are people who I don't think that most people could understand what they were saying, even though they're talking about the liberation of poor people. So it's like the poor people they're liberating aren't really able to get the words they're using that is like the road to liberation, right? So I think culturally, which I'm bringing it full circle, in terms of culture, I totally agree. I think the last thing I want to emphasize is that in this movement, I really want to see a culture of accessibility being emphasized, and a place where culturally it feels appropriate, whether you are of faith, no matter what your economic background, that you actually feel safe in a space to speak. Because even at places like this, a lot of times if somebody, came in here, some people who have been living on the street for 25 years, they have a certain way of speaking, right, in New York City. And a lot of times that is looked at that feels abrasive in a space like this when you're in the new school. So my kind of movement that I want to see is that even people who have been faced with the most marginalization are faced with the most embrace, right? And are faced with absolute, like taking people we're all in a room right now in this moment. What do we have? What can we bring? And letting go of all the stuff that's inside of us that is actually just capitalism and the million isms that are reproducing themselves in the moment, in this forum, right?
We have time for one or two more comments from up here, so...
I just want to briefly say something. Thank you so much for coming up and talking about religion. And I'm sorry that it felt really intimidating, but I know why it is. I grew up sort of in and around the left, and there was a lot more. I think there still is some deep prejudice about religion. And of course, it's like, what do you really mean when you talk about religion? You're talking about authoritarian institutions far away, or are you talking about people's everyday practice and belief system? But I think I really came of age as an activist, as an anti-nuclear activist, and particularly at the Nevada test site, which was a great movement out of which a lot came. And it became pretty clear to a lot of us that the people who actually started that movement were Franciscan nuns and priests who we became friends with, who were great. And the Japanese Buddhists showed up because this was also about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there were these devout Mormon women because they were downwinders. And then these Native Americans showed up and said, you're all on our land, but we're going to give you permission to be here, but we're not going to give the Department of Energy permission to keep nuclear testing. And so we got drawn into Native American religion too. That actually, there's a kind of white left that thinks religion is over there, but the African American progressive movement has from its inception been harbored by the black churches. Cesar Chavez was a devout Catholic, and Catholic churches, Catholic priests, Catholic congregations have been really important in the sanctuary movement of the 80s and the immigration rights business now. That the occupies on the West Coast, I've seen Buddhist, Christian, very strong Jewish presences, I'm not sure what I missed, and Native presences and stuff. So I think that one of the things I really like about this moment is that it's really tolerant and inclusive, and it's not really the either or. If you're a punk rock, you hate country music. If you're this, you know, I feel like at our best we're post-sectarian, which doesn't mean we don't have strong values, but we're really, really interested in building coalitions and figuring out, like, you know, where our values matter, where we respect other people's values, and how big can our tent be.
We should really take a break here for a second. Just to let you know that in the next session, we're going to get considerably more concrete. We're going to be asking questions like, you know, do we go back to occupying in the spring? What's going to happen at G8? Should we be organizing around debts? What other kinds of organizing should we be doing concretely? So it'll be really valuable to have people from the audience weighing in on that as well. The other thing that will be really valuable is if you in the audience go back there and buy books.
Ren, I'd like to speak.
Well, we just have to stop right now because we have to take a break.
Right. Why can't we just? I'd like to make one statement about labor.
Okay. Having said that, we're going to have.
No. Look.
Okay.
I think this has been valuable as an airing of issues. There was something very important, I believe, that was brought up earlier, and I'd like to open that can wider. Pat O'Donnell said before, "Why is democracy incompatible with capitalism?" A young woman here said that the academic system is a product of capitalism. What do we mean by capitalism? Is capitalism a system of, do we assume that capitalism is a system in which small bodies of people control vast sums of capital that dominate other people's lives? Or is capitalism also conceivably a system in which people take initiative by investing something of their own, some often labor and often other things, and by putting their money where their ideas are, actually create things like bookstores. So I think we're glib collectively if we think that we've solved our big problems of definition by putting ourselves on the side of the angels and declaring that we're against capitalism, or at least we're against the side of the devils. Because capitalism is a multitude of possibilities. The academic system long predated capitalism, long predated it. There was an academic system in France and England long before
Todd,
capitalism.
1 minute.
1 minute. No, but the reason this is not just moot, although it is abstract, is that we have to be careful lest we think we have gone to the heart of really difficult questions with bumper sticker slogans. And, finally I want to allude back to this man who I think spoke quite beautifully about religion, but he said something else that I want to underscore. He said, you can't fight for a future that has no place for you. Now, a lot of the people in the 99% want a future. Many of them are already living in a present in which what they believe in is having a small something that they, to some degree, control, that has relations with others in a market which is also an institution that long predated capitalism. Many of these people don't disbelieve in capitalism. They will not fight for a future that thinks it's solved their problem with a cavalier statement, "We're done with capitalism."
Okay, thank you. David, you have the last word. It was your panel.
I'm not going to argue about the fate of capitalism right now. I just wanted to
But you'll talk into the microphone no matter what you do.
Okay. I will sidestep the question of capitalism for now. But I did want to say something about labor. Two little things about labor. I mean, this is something dear to my heart because I come from a family of laborers. My father was a plate stripper, and my mother was a garment worker. They were working class people who worked really hard, so their kid wouldn't have to be a working class person, and they. And there's a deep ambivalence about the validation of labor. I mean, I think that if that means understand that value comes from labor and not from capital, yeah, nothing could be more important than that. If it comes to validating a certain model of what of wage labor as inherently good or what has been reduced to wage labor, I'd actually go the opposite way. I think we need to have a culture where we completely change our conception of what labor is and what types of labor are important. And I was thinking, you look at that we are the 99% tumbler. Most people have seen that page, I imagine. If you look at the narratives you see there, I think it shows a real transformation is starting to happen. One reason this thing caught hold is there are basic changes happening in the culture of how we think about things like this. And what I saw in that Tumblr page, 80% or something of the people on that page were women. They, most of them, and this included the men, were working somehow in sort of caring industries. They were teachers, but they were nurses, they were social workers, they were doing things for other people. And what struck me as really poignant about it is they were all saying, I want to have a career where I don't have to just, profit and get things for myself and be an asshole. I want to actually be nice to other people and care for other people. But if I do that, I end up so deeply in debt I can't take care of my own family. And I think, organizing a movement around people like that is a way of starting to say, well, what is labor and what types of, I think we should redefine, what work even is, starting from caring labor as the primary form of labor. And it's broad transformations like that, which are going to bring about a different world. And to do that, we have to throw open our imaginations and start realizing we can rethink these things. We've been taught for 30 years that making a move like that, rethinking basic principles is no longer allowed. So, I think the nice thing about talking about ultimate goals is just what we're talking about. We can have 25 utopias. That's better than having one. But the point is that we're talking about utopias again. We're trying to ask these big questions, and that's what really matters, to unshackle our minds.
So, thank you. Okay. We're going to take a 10-minute break. You're going to buy books, and we'll be back here in 10 minutes.